Okay, so we are now on the verge of the American Revolution, and we are on the verge of seeing how the ideas that we looked at over the last couple of weeks, those ideas of Britishness and the growing trade that is going on, are going to impact um, the rise of the revolution. Today we're taking sort of a snapshot of what does the American colonies look like, British North American colonies look like on the verge of that revolution. And one of the big things that's important to notice here is that the population of those colonies had exponentially grown over the last 50 or so years in the 18th century, right? That growth had increased the population from about 100 or so thousand to about a million by the 1750s and 60s, right? So we're talking about a massive amount of growth. Now that growth did occur naturally, right? There were babies born here, but there was also a ton of immigration. Now the immigration was both forced and free, right? There were some people who were free and came here to try and improve their lives, improve the lives of their families, and came here willingly. There are other people, and a good number of those other people, who came forced, right? And that would be people who were brought over as slaves from Africa. Now, the period between about 1700 and 1800 was the height of the transatlantic slave trade. So there is a massive number of unfree forced labor that comes across the Atlantic Ocean during this period. So we call this time within the American experience the Colonial Melting Pot. There are a lot of different groups of people who are living in North American colonies at this point. The largest are the British, right? And that should make sense. The largest group are going to be people from England. They're going to be Scottish. They're going to be Irish. They're going to be Scots-Irish. Those are going to be the largest groups. But then there's also a lot of other folks who have moved over, right? There are French Huguenots. So the French Huguenots were French Protestants, French Presbyterians who had been persecuted in Europe. They're going to be Scots-Irish, as I've said. They're going to be Swiss. They're going to be Swedes, right? They're going to be people from all over Europe. There is going to be about 20% of the population made up of African slaves. This is the forced, unfree labor that comes from Africa into the New World to do the labor on plantations, to do work in factories and in manufacturing. It was the most diverse region in the world at this point because of the massive amount of immigration that is occurring. Now, if you look at the map, there's information there on the right, but if you look at the map, right, I want us to look here for a second, because what you're going to notice is it comes in waves, right? Immigration here comes in waves. And if you notice, right, the first immigrants, right, are the English. So they're going to have a lot of dominance along the coast. There's going to be a large amount of African people, certainly in the Chesapeake region in the south where there's cash crop production. But then you see, right, as the Scots-Irish come later, they move more inward, right, more into the interior of the country. You have Germans, right, the Pennsylvania Dutch that emerge here in Pennsylvania. You have the Dutch, right, obviously along the Hudson River in what was New Amsterdam, right? So all of this creates, there's sort of this onion layering effect, right? As colonies come, as colonists come, they go to the cheapest and, the sort of next open land. And obviously that means going west. For the Scots-Irish, right, they basically are squatting for most of their existence. They are coming here and they are moving into territory that, again, is not necessarily settled, and they are claiming it for themselves. There are this also creates another issue, which is, again, which we talked about last week, Europeans infringing upon and moving into the land of Native Americans, right? And that's going to create problems towards those natives. When we look at the internal social structure of these colonial societies, right, there is a massive difference between where that wealth is located. In places like the North, there's manufacturing, there's ship owning, there's distilleries, right? They are very significant in those respects, right? But society is becoming increasingly unequal because in the South, let me say in the North. In the North, right, again, there's these massive landowners and massive factory owners and manufacturing owners that are owning huge portions of the economy, huge portions of the wealth. And there's a lot of poor folks who are working. So society's becoming less egalitarian, right? One of the things we mentioned a couple of weeks ago was that those who were rich were not super rich, and those who were poor were not super poor. That's changing now by the later 1700s. There's also a growing number of destitute people who are coming to North America, people who need jobs, working in, or need a fresh start, I guess is a better way to say it. So they flee England or Britain and they come here for that. In the South, right, there's this growing gentry lifestyle or genteel lifestyle that is emerging. These wealthy planters want to show themselves to be sort of like country gentlemen. And they're importing goods from Britain, they're importing stuff from Europe, and they are trying to show how great they are. So what are some of these first economies and first industries that are driving this growing wealth? In the South, it's still tobacco, right? The tobacco monoculture is still the dominant type of culture. There is still this massive amount of tobacco going back to Europe, and that is true particularly for places like Glasgow in Scotland, even sort of western side of England, right? So places like Liverpool, right? Those places are dominating the tobacco trade. Glasgow, Scotland is by far the most dominant because you could get to Glasgow about 2 weeks quicker than you could get to London. So getting to Glasgow, you could then ship your stuff into France, northern Scandinavia, very easily. And this is what this is important. In New England, it's shipbuilding and fishing. There's growing population, not just in the Americas, but there's growing population in England and Scotland and Ireland and France and Germany, what becomes Germany. And because of that, there needs to be more food. So there's a lot of cod fishing, salting it and sending it back to Europe. There's also, we need, in Europe, old forests have been basically depleted. So by doing lumbering and shipbuilding, you can offset the lumber costs from Europe. The growing population in British North American colonies also leads to the demand for trading with other parts of colonial countries here in the New World, right? As there is a demand for goods, as there is a demand for resources, those Europeans living in North America need more goods, and they want goods from non-British sources. So they start smuggling really goods with goods from the French Caribbean and other French colonies, And again, these become important areas where the British are going to not like that, right? So in 1773, Parliament passes the Molasses Act to cut down on that smuggling. Alcohol is a huge industry here in the colonial period, and quite frankly, up until the mid 1800s. Taverns were extremely important towards the life of people in all communities. There were businesses that women could run by themselves. Women could produce the alcohol and sell the alcohol. Women could own taverns and sell their goods. But also, this is a place where all people from all society could come in, right? Poor people, rich people, and they could be found in the tavern. The tavern was the place where you got your news. But alcohol was extremely important because water was not terribly clean. So alcohol was important because you could drink it and it was healthy and wasn't going to get you sick. So it was an extremely important location. Again, all these things are the sort of major economies of the time. Education becomes really important at this point as well. So there are 9 colleges and other institutions established. I mean, there are academies, but there are 9 institutions that will ultimately become colleges, right? So the first college we've already mentioned is Harvard College, founded in the 1630s. But then you also have the College of William and Mary, what becomes Rutgers, what becomes Columbia. So Columbia College was known as King's College. You have what becomes Brown University. It was called the College of Providence. Not to be confused with Providence College that exists today. You had what would become the College of Philadelphia, which becomes the University of Pennsylvania. You have Georgetown. Well, Georgetown's established later, but Georgetown ultimately, right? And it's a lot of these are established by religious institutions, right? King's College and Harvard. I should have mentioned Yale, Harvard, Yale, Brown, Columbia, right? These are all institutions established to educate people who would become priests or ministers. So you have some major religious groups that are important here, right? The College of William and Mary and Columbia, what will become Columbia, are there to train, and Harvard are there to train Anglican ministers, Anglican priests. Institutions like Yale, Brown, Princeton, I guess those are Yale, Brown, and Princeton, were established to educate congregational or Puritan ministers, right? Presbyterians. All of this helps lead to the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was established, this piece of religious revivalism that emerges in the mid-1700s as a way of increasing religious devotion, but it was also in a lot of ways fear over the unknown. And there was people trying to focus on sort of God's omnipotence and God's omniscience, so that we could sort of turn over our feelings to that God. And there are a lot of the speeches sort of talk about the human depravity, right? Jonathan Edwards, the famous minister at the time, revival leader, talks about being one of the sinners in the hands of the angry God, and sort of the ways in which people have sort of moved away from their religious devotion. The importance of this is that there is created a disagreement between what are called the old lights and the new lights. The new lights focus much more on the sort of practical education of being a minister. There's a lot of study of practical theology, theology in general, where old lights look more at sort of less what you might call book knowledge, but more sort of devotion to sort of evangelicalism, right? The sort of text of the Bible. These two dividing sources put the churches at odds with one another and put attention at odds with one another. But it also helps springboard a lot, right? There's this then creation of academic institutions in order to train those ministers. And again, it's creating sort of a better society. And in terms of that creation of a better society, there is the movement of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment comes to North America in the late 1700s as more institutions are being established as part of that institution Enlightenment ideas, right? These schools are important, but you also have churches becoming important as religious leaders are some of the most educated, if not the most educated people in most communities. You have people like Benjamin Franklin, and you have Phyllis Wheatley, and you have John Adams, Benjamin Rush, right? The names that many of us have studied before are working in different communities, trying to build up educational facilities and social and cultural facilities, right? So there's newspapers that are established. There are There are philosophical institutions. There are libraries. There are more schools, right? And there's a lot of importance here in terms of what cultural institutions are being established. So throughout the 18th century, there is a growing urban environment in which people are living in the New World. There's growing population that's bringing in a lot more people and creating a situation where, questions of religious diversity, questions of cultural assimilation are going to become part of the dialect.